it lags a little bit in the beginning.
No worries.
All right, everyone. Welcome to number 69 of From the Ground Up. A couple things to get out of the way before we get started. Port City Pythons. That is where you can find t-shirts that will support our podcast, as well as you will see in our YouTube videos, as well as the links on this podcast if you're listening to it on iTunes. Those go to Amazon. You shop as you normally would, and that gives us a little kickback and puts money into hosting this podcast as well. And then also, I want to let you guys know that I was on Morelia Python Radio last Tuesday, rather. So if you guys could go support them and listen to them if you don't already, do that. Hopefully, I don't sound like too much of an idiot, but I'm sure I do. It's hard when you're recording a podcast because I feel like things I may believe now or think now, in like a year, I'll probably think the opposite or think something different or learn something new and realize I was an idiot. So don't take my word for things. And on that note, today we have John Michels from Black Pearl Reptiles. He works with a bunch of Drymarchon. And so, John, can you give us a little overview of what you work with and how long you've been keeping snakes?
Sure. Well, the keeping part has been forever, right? I mean, like a lot of us, I've got photos when I'm a toddler, with big old snakes in my hands and whatever. So it's been a lifelong thing. And, I guess it's been about 15 years ago that I thought, it'd be pretty cool to kind of breed a few things, and then I thought, well, hey, I've got these baby snakes laying around. It'd be cool to kind of sell a couple of them and pay for the feeders. And so it was kind of a self-sustaining hobby. And then, but once I had more money than I needed to pay for the feeders, then it was, all right, well, I'm not going to pocket this money. Let's go ahead and reinvest it. And I just sort of built things from there. And so now it's just a full-scale Drymarchon operation. So it's working with the animals I love, and it's gone a little bit past the self-sustaining hobby, which has been nice. But it's a labor of love. But it's there are absolutely days that I am tired of the cage cleaning and all that sort of thing. But like all of us, it's I do it because I love working with the animals.
So I know that Drymarchon aren't usually considered exactly a beginner reptile. So what other snakes have you kept, and how did you realize that you loved Drymarchon?
Well, to give kind of the full history, I like field herping as well, and I live in Southern California. So it kind of started with, when I was a kid, I'd go out and I'd catch a bunch of gopher snakes and things, and I'd throw them all in one big cage, and the males would fight and breed the females and the whole thing. And I'd get eggs, and I'd hatch the eggs, and I'd release the babies and the adults back where I caught them. And every year I'd sort of do the process over again. And, and then when I started kind of wanting to intentionally breed captive bred snakes, it started off with Honduran and milk snakes. I did that, and the Honduran and milk morphs. I played around with that for a while, and I was always sort of fascinated with the Drymarchon. And when I was first getting started, Eastern Indigos were high on my list, but kind of out of my budget. And so I started off with a pair of black-tail Cribos. And, I was fortunate enough to find them from a local guy they were adults and proven breeders. And so I was able to get those breeding right away in the first year. And that was a steep learning curve on getting all the babies and getting the babies feeding and all of that. But, like you said a few minutes ago about just sounding like an idiot one year, and the next year, because it's, we learn. And so every year, I learn new things, and I feel like, way more proficient than I was the year before and things like that. And I still have a long ways to go, that's for sure. But so it started off with black-tail Cribos, and, from there I got into the yellowtails, and I was able to get my Eastern Indigos. And I thought, well, if that's what I'm going to do, I may as well just work with all the Drymarchon species. So yellowtail Cribos, black-tail Cribos, unicolor Cribos, the Texas Indigos, the Mexican red-tail Indigos, and the Eastern Indigos. So I built breeding groups of all those. and with all of them deliberately kind of trying to amass animals and bloodlines that were going to make for good breeders and nice looking animals, and were as genetically diverse as I could. And so, there's a large breeding group of each of those kind of 6 major types of Drymarchon. So then from there, it's, you got to have little side projects to keep things a little diverse. So, I got into some of the Mexican tiger rat snakes and some of the Barron's racers, particularly the blue ones, which are a lot of fun. I have a business partner who is he's the head keeper of reptiles at the LA Zoo, and he brings a lot of expertise with all those snakes, as well as a passion for tortoises. So he and I also work with some of the rare tortoises. We've got radiated tortoises and Hermes star tortoises, and the most exciting thing we have going on now is that we have an adult herd of Galapagos tortoises, and we've gotten our first eggs just in the past month. So we're really excited about that. So it gives us a lot to do and a lot to talk about, right?
Yeah, I was wondering, I saw you sharing a bunch of tortoise stuff, and from my knowledge, I thought there was only one person who had bred Galapagos in captivity in the US previously. Is that true? And how did you guys go about it?
Well, listen, I will admit from the beginning that the tortoise thing, I am not nearly as proficient. So I will tell you what I know and go through as much as I can. But I would defer to my partner who's not here on all those points. But that being said, my knowledge is there are a group of guys in Florida that have been successfully breeding them for a few years, and they've been doing a good job, and we've been talking with them a lot about husbandry and sharing ideas back and forth. And then there's also been Mr. Fife in Arizona, who's also bred them and has been working with exotic pets in Las Vegas with all that kind of stuff. But outside of those, whether there's more beyond that, I don't really know. Those are the only ones that I know about. To my knowledge, we're the only private keepers in California that have ever bred them. And I say bred them in that, right now we have eggs. We are assuming catastrophe doesn't happen and that we'll get healthy hatchlings here in a couple of months. But I understand that I believe the last I heard that there was a zoo, I think it was the San Diego Zoo, that produced them decades ago. But to my knowledge, and again, this could be incorrect, I think we're the only people in California to have successfully bred them. So, and again, success, we're just still in the process on that. But
right, yeah. How long is incubation typically? Do you know offhand?
My understanding is it's about 90 days, 100 days, something like that. Again, I could be wrong on that. I'm just going off my memory what my partner told me when we had a very excited conversation about eggs being put into the incubator. So we're about halfway through that period. So hopefully in a month or two, we'll get some good news.
I've heard of things like heat cycling and stuff with eggs and tortoises, which sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Right.
Do you have to do that with these?
My understanding is that we are not doing that with these, but again, I don't really know. He's the tortoise wizard. I let him kind of do his thing, but I know that he's done that with other species of tortoise. We also do the giant South African, the giant leopard tortoises, and I know he's done things like that. I don't really fully understand that process, so I'll claim ignorance on that.
Yeah, sorry, I got distracted by the whole tortoise thing. I don't know anything about tortoises, so that's why I'm asking questions.
I'll tell you what, I didn't either, to be honest with you, and it became very real for me a couple years ago. His ranch needed to be evacuated with a brush fire that was nearby, and so I have a enclosed backyard, but not geared for tortoises. But I took all of his tortoises while we were evacuating, and that was, it was all of our Galapagoses. There was all of our leopard tortoises and all of that, and we just threw them in my backyard. And my family and I had the good fortune to be able to kind of take care of our Galapagos tortoises for a few months while we got things together. And I have to tell you, being a snake guy, not a tortoise guy, I completely did not understand these animals. And, um, I was familiar with them. Um, I'd always visit him when I go to his house, but you don't really get it until you're with them every day. The level of sociability and temperament and personability of Galapagos tortoises is something that I couldn't possibly fathom until I was with them every day. And it got to a point where my wife, who's not necessarily an animal person, certainly not a reptile person, would wake up early before work to go out and just say hi to the tortoises. And they'll stick their necks out and they want to be scratched, and they will. There are a couple of ours will literally come when you call their name. I mean, there's a degree of intelligence in there that you just can't fathom, and the inner workings of the relationship of the tortoises with each other and with us is something that you just don't get until you're with them every day. And I tell you, when we brought him back to my partner's ranch, once we cleared everything up, my wife and my kids were sobbing. I mean, it was like family pets, like a dog. It was just really, really cool experience to be able to work with them every day like that. So, they're pretty neat. They're pretty neat. Our Galapagoses are a lot of fun.
That's amazing. So before everyone gets too excited,
Mhm.
how do you manage to get things like space or the proper temperature down there in Southern California? Are there things that you need to watch out for in the winter?
Now, are we talking about tortoises or are we talking about
And
snakes?
just tortoises. This will be the last one. Then we'll
Yeah,
we'll
no
we'll
problem.
track back.
Well, it's my partner deliberately, as a few years ago, he and his wife and family purchased a ranch in order to be able to have the space to do what we wanted to do. And we quickly then grew from just having a couple of Galapagoses to a whole herd of them, and along with the other species. So, we bought a tractor, we plowed out the land, we made the pens, we did the whole thing. And so the Galops have a barn that's fully insulated with heating inside of it. So in the winter, they go inside. Most nights when it's cool out, they'll go inside. Um, and even in the winter in Southern California during the daytime, they'll still come out and roam around the pen. And where it gets interesting is when you have a couple stubborn ones that want to stay outside overnight and it's really too cold for them. And I tell you, it's not easy to move a 400-pound animal in the middle of the night when you're trying to get them to go back inside.
Oh, I'm sure. So let's go back. So if people missed the first couple minutes, I know some people in the chat came in a little bit late. Um, your Cribos, you said you
Yeah,
got a pair of, I believe you said blacktails.
correct.
Were those coming in as imports or were they captive, born and bred?
No, well, this was I got them as adults from local gentleman who got them as adults, and I've since gone back and tracked back what I could of the lineage of those two animals, and I believe they were originally produced many years ago by one of the Florida importers, and so whether they were produced from wild caught animals, I don't know really the history of them, but I did a fair amount of homework on it because. It was those two snakes whose lineage eventually produced the exanthic black-tailed Cribo. So trying to figure out, where those two adults came from and how that all worked was something I tried to do because those animals changed hands a few times before they ended up in my care. So um, I those animals were captive bred, but how far back they are from wild caught, I don't really know.
And did you try to, I mean, you were trying to backtrack to see if they were possible hets, or did you have any hope of that, or have you bred that out?
Well, it has been bred out. So the way it ended up working was that I got the original pair from a gentleman named Jim Pascal, and and Jim had produced them a year or two prior to me buying them from him, and so he had some offspring from them. And several years after I'd been breeding them and selling animals all around the country and the world, really, um, Jim asked if he could breed one of his females back to the father, just kind of on a breeding loan. He didn't have a male to go with it at the time. And so we did that, and that's where the Xanthic popped out. And there was there were two Xanthics in that clutch, and so I kept one, and Jim kept one, and he has since bred his raised his Xanthic up and has bred it, and I've bred some of mine, and so we've proven that it is in fact a recessive trait. So it's kind of come out of that lineage of that original pair that I got from Jim. Gosh, this was 2007 or 8, something like that. That I originally had these animals as adults, so they're pretty elderly now. In fact, this year that original pair, only produced infertile eggs, so they might be ending their time as breeders.
Right. So I'm not familiar with how long it takes these guys to mature. So those babies you raised up, or those Xanthics, since 2006, how long did it take you to get visual Xanthics and then breed Xanthic to Xanthic, stuff like that?
Well, the first Xanthics were I got the original pair back in 2006, 7, whatever it was, but the Xanthics were not produced until, I'm so bad with dates, I believe it was 2014. And oddly enough, there's a group in Northern California called GBU Enterprises, and they produced Xanthics and put it all over their social media. They got a clutch from a pair of snakes that they hadn't bred in a long time, and there were 3 Xanthics that came out, and I was actually in line to acquire one of them. And we had a deal kind of all set up, and the night before we were going to meet up for me to look at the animals, I produced them in my own garage. So needless to say, I didn't kind of go through that deal, although I've since acquired some of those animals. But it was kind of interesting the way it worked. But that was 2014, I believe. I might be off a year. Again, I'm bad with numbers, or dates. But so we've since raised those up, and then of course we had the animals that produced them in the first place. So we knew we had 100% hets, and then we've got the Xanthics that we've raised up as well. And generally speaking, with Drymarchon, you're looking at 3 to 4, possibly 5 years to reach sexual maturity, depending, of course, on the feeding regimen and all that. So, some species are breeding at 1.5, 2 years. These guys will take more like 3 or 4.
Yeah, I was just wondering, just because we keep smaller colubrids, but I didn't know if there was a large difference between, something larger like a Cribo. Can you explain a little bit on their size and how often you feed them?
Well, in general, the Drymarchon species is one of the larger colubrids you have, right? And so, they can approach lengths of 8 to 9 feet, but generally more like 7 is a little bit more of an average. And what's really neat about them is that they're not constrictors, and they're not venomous. They're not rear-fanged. They're just really strong and intense. And so one of the things I like about them, they're kind of like a cobra without the venom, in that they don't constrict. They just sort of rely on jaw strength and power to subdue their prey, and they'll eat damn near anything they can fit into their mouth. So you're talking, in captivity, you're feeding them fish, you're feeding them chicks, quail, obviously rodents, but in the wild they'll eat snakes, and in fact that's one of their more preferred prey items in the wild. I think I just read a study on eastern indigo saying that they tend to gravitate more towards snakes in the wild, but they'll eat anything, whether it's baby turtles, baby alligators, it doesn't matter. Whatever fits in their mouth, they'll eat it, and they don't constrict. So they're prey generalists. They'll eat anything they can without constriction. And so it's really kind of fun to watch. I don't feed my animals anything live, but they've got a really strong feeding response, and they'll go right after whatever you have with intensity. But as far as feeding regimen goes, you asked about that. Generally speaking, they have a higher metabolism than most snakes, and so which is fun, but it kind of works against you in a few ways, of course. But they'll eat as often as you want to feed them. But I'll generally feed my animals every 4 or 5 days, something like that. And then, in the cooler parts of the winter, I'll scale it back to more like every 7 or 8 days. But they eat pretty often, which means they poop pretty often. I mean, they'll cycle through a meal in 2 days, and the Drymarchon genus has a reputation for being pretty foul in that department, and that's something we can get into as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something I heard. And just to explain the fact that a random person showed up in the middle, we usually do the podcast with me, and this is Melissa.
Hi, Melissa.
Sorry, I was at work.
She was at work, and she does a lot of the dealing with the people in the chat, and then she'll also have questions and stuff. So I just wanted to explain that there's not just a random extra person.
Can you catch me up quickly?
Yeah, so we're just talking. We actually just kind of got into it. We're talking about Cribos. So I was going to ask you. You were talking about all the different things that you feed Cribos. Do you think that is a big deal for someone keeping Drymarchon to always, switch up what kind of things you're feeding it?
As far as the health of the animal, I don't know. There are a lot of people that successfully keep Indigos and Cribos on just a strictly rodent diet. So I don't want to completely dismiss that as something that you cannot do. But that being said, I am a believer in my experience. I have noticed that my animals are healthier, happier, and more fertile when they're on a varied diet. So a typical meal for me and my animals will be a rat and a chick. We also make our own supplements that we use, and I pack the powder in veggie capsules and I put them down the throat of the chick, and they'll eat it that way. And then, I'll supplement here and there with fish. I'll supplement with frog legs. I'll buy, big frog legs from an Asian market down the street. Fish. Again, like I said, I'm an avid field herper as well. So if I come across a snake that's recently been run over on the road, I'll collect that. I freeze it to ensure that any kind of parasites are killed off. Freeze it for a month, and they'll love that. Interesting side note on that is that the indigos will actually defecate out the rattles of rattlesnakes. They don't digest them, which is kind of interesting. So you're going through their stool and cleaning their cages, and you get fully intact rattles inside of their poo.
Weird, because you would think they're digesting the bone, but for whatever reason, I thought the rattle was made out of the same thing. Well, I guess it's keratin, and it would be easier to break down.
Right.
You would think, and I don't have a scientific explanation for why that happens. It's at this point, it's just an interesting side note.
That's mind blowing.
And I wonder if it's across like the board. Like, is there any snake that can break down?
I don't know. Try this king snake later.
I know. That's what I go to. Our king snake that eats anything. Like,
I do also work with Mussurana, which is a type of, not to derail the conversation, but that's another snake eating snake. And they digest the rattles no problem. Oh. So I don't know what to say.
That's interesting. So that little like capsule of vitamins or whatever you're putting in there, is there anything that you're going for in particular, like a certain vitamin that you want more of, or a mineral or anything like that?
Again, this is one that I have to kind of claim a little bit of ignorance on because my partner kind of packs most of it. We start with a product that I believe is made by Missouri. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I believe it's a powder that they'll use. I believe it's for amphibians, if I'm not mistaken. And we'll mix in some calcium, but it's got a lot of different animal parts, fish, frog, and so forth, all kind of ground up. I don't think it's too different from Reptilinks or things like that, but we'll pack it in there as a powder, and I use veggie capsules, and I got a little pill packer and whatever. It's kind of odd the way I do it, but it does seem to, along with other things, increase the fertility of the animals and kind of the way the animals look. They seem to be happier when they're on more of a varied diet. So, again, back to my comment earlier, I don't want to completely dismiss a rodent-only diet. A lot of people do it with success, but we generally believe that the more varied the diet, the better, particularly when you're dealing with a prey generalist like an indigo snake.
Absolutely. Is your mic all right?
No, I don't know. It's the thing keeps coming out, and that's why it keeps.
Oh, okay. It keeps on switching back and forth.
Yeah, it's just.
Look at what happens when you show up.
No.
So, just size and cage size as far as these guys.
Well, so they'll get to be, like I said, 7-8 feet long, and so A lot of people like to provide larger cage sizes. They are sexually dimorphic, so males will get larger than females. And I know with a lot of species, it's the opposite. The difference is not enormous, but generally speaking, the males will get a half foot to a foot longer than females, and it will generally be more girthy. But with that being said, as far as cage size goes, your bare minimum for a smaller adult is you're looking at 4x2 cage, something along those lines. But then 6x2 cages, for a larger adult can be used as well. Some people even go larger than that. I did play around with kind of using large cages for a while, and like a lot of reptiles, they do end up spending a lot of their time just sort of sitting in their hide box and don't feel like they're utilizing all that space. But like anything else, also, you don't want them to get obese, and so being able to move around, helps too. And feeding regimen obviously helps with that. If you let them eat as often as they would, they're not too different than me, that they'll quickly balloon up in size.
Yeah, there was a study that I believe is like the Orient Society was a part of, but I think it's indigos travel within like a mile radius or something like that. So I think they are like, very active in compared to
Just don't see it.
other snakes. We probably don't see it because we feed them,
Right.
and like they don't have to look for food. But
well, and I think part of that is kind of connected with the being such a prey generalist, that they actively forage for food. They're not sitting in ambush, and while they will go down burrows and eat whatever's down a burrow, they chase stuff down, and it's kind of similar to what a racer might do. They actively travel looking for food, looking for mates. They also drink more water than any other type of snake that I've ever seen, and I don't know how much that plays into how much they travel in the wild. But yeah, I have read that, like you have, that they tend to have pretty large home ranges, which makes it kind of difficult for their long-term success in the wild with the kind of habitat fragmentation that they're facing in Florida and Georgia and things like that. So it makes it difficult to maintain healthy populations when you've got roads and things and housing developments all fragmenting their habitat. When you have reptiles that have a very small range, it's not quite as big of a deal, but when they travel a lot, it's a problem.
absolutely. And now backtracking a little bit, talking about how they are so general in what they eat. Obviously, they eat other snakes. So are you worried when you are pairing that they may eat each other?
It comes up. It comes up. There are some of my snakes are more prone, some of my males are more prone to be a problem than others. But it has happened. So it is something that I try to watch. The other issue with that is, like a lot of snakes, the males will often bite the females as part of their mating courtship. And with the jaw strength and the teeth of these snakes, that can cause a lot of damage to the females as well. So that's kind of something I have to be really on top of. And we've had to do some vet work, some emergency care on some of our females when they get in with an aggressive male. I will say it's generally not out of a cannibalistic issue. It does happen, but it's more often that the males will bite the females and will often lacerate them pretty badly.
Wow. So it's significant enough to get something like stitches, or you
yeah. Oh yeah. No, it's difficult to understand because you've worked with kink snakes and other snakes that lead other snakes, and but the jaw strength and the teeth of indigo snakes it's hard to describe, but it's another level.
Mm.
If you get an indigo snake biting and clamping down on you when you're a female snake and you get bitten on the neck, it can cut them wide open.
So I wonder. Sorry, you go. I wonder, in the wild, are there less? I wonder if there's less females out there because of this happening, or is their skin? Have they adapted over time to like heal from that with no problem? But
I don't know. I haven't read anything about breeding behavior in the wild. I don't know if they bite as much as they do in captivity or not. I can't really speak to that. So, I don't know how much of an issue that would really be.
Gotcha.
I think if they're not in a captive setting and they're more spread out, my hope would be that they're not going to bite as much as they do in captivity out of safety for the animals. But I would sort of assume that's the case, that they don't bite as much. But I don't have any. I haven't read anything, any scientific publications that would back that up.
I think also in captivity, we try to go the extra mile to ensure our snake's health in comparison to, I'm sure you go out and you see snakes with nipped off tails, with chunks out their back, chunks out of everywhere,
right,
and they're still going. It's just, fun. I bet like a certain amount of them probably die of some type of infection or something like that. Right. But I mean, that's just nature, I guess.
Right.
Well, and I would guess too that, when you're in a captive setting and you're trying to breed the snakes, you're trying to pair them up, that there's a certain amount of guesswork too, on if the males are ready and the females are ready and if the timing is right. And I would venture to say that some of that biting is due to females not being as ready as the male is.
And they're trying
to hold her down, kind of a thing. Again, that's just speculation on my part, but I would imagine in the wild that the snakes know when they're ready to breed, and when both the male and the female are ready, they're gonna do what they need to do. But that being said, pairing your snakes, the Drymarchon, you do have to be vigilant.
Yeah, that makes total sense, because we see, even with when we pair corns, it's like the beginning of the season. I mean, we're locking them together in a small little confined area where the female can get away, and it's essentially a rape. And then as the season goes on, it gets more and more consensual.
A little bit more, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, right. Yeah. I think take so much longer. I don't know.
I think we just may not be totally attuned.
I don't know that the males necessarily care.
So talking about that and breeding, what is the brumation like, and what's the difference between, say, yellowtails, the Mexicans, the Easterns, all that stuff?
So I really cycle them all the same. The only ones that I cycle differently are the Eastern Indigos. I tend to keep those colder in the winter. And I've noticed that does increase fertility. It also decreases the potential for birth defects. But generally speaking, I kind of let the natural Southern California cycles kind of do the trick. I have the luxury to be able to just let the nights get a little cooler in the winter than they do in the summer. I don't do that, manually. So my animals will just sort of cycle. So I keep them in the garage. The garage is temperature controlled and insulated. However, the night times in the winter time will be, 10 to 15 degrees colder than they are in the summertime. And that kind of takes care of my cycling. The Easterns, I do intentionally get them colder. What's interesting about the Drymarchon genus, at least in my experience, has been that they are winter breeders rather than spring breeders. And so they will breed when it is cold, or when they're colder. I tend to pair them together in anywhere between October and in December. And I've had Eastern Indigos locking up at 55 degrees, and they'll be outside and locked up for 24 hours at a time, kind of a thing. And that's what tends to produce the most fertile clutches with the Easterns. But that's a little bit about the brumation.
Wow, so that goes pretty much against logic.
Right.
So is the female holding on to the sperm during brumation, or is she actually growing follicles and stuff in that cool temperature without food? Or are you feeding them?
That's why I do feed them less frequently and smaller meal sizes throughout the winter. Some of them go off feed altogether. The males will often go off feed altogether, which is not horribly uncommon with a lot of snakes. And then the females will start going off feed once they're starting to produce their eggs and they're getting more gravid. But yeah, when I'm pairing them together, the females are still a thin appropriate weight, and they really don't start beefing up until February. And starting to look like they're swollen. So as far as the production of follicles and storing sperm, I don't know. I haven't, taken an ultrasound to look for the follicles or things, but that tends to be the way it kind of works with the way I breed things is, pair them up in the late fall, early winter, and the females will start swelling in February or so and start looking gravid. And then generally speaking, end of March, early April is when they start laying their clutches.
Wow. So I had no idea how to breed these things before. All right. So now we got to backtrack again. Are you beefing them up in the summertime? So, I mean, during our regular colubrids, we start beefing up during spring. Right. Are you doing it during the summertime?
Yeah, I mean, again, it kind of depends on the individual. Some of the females don't want to eat at all before they lay their eggs. After they lay their eggs, they're ravenous, and that's when I'm, small but frequent meals tend to be the way I work with the females and getting them to recover their body weight. The males will and can get obese if you overfeed them too much in the wintertime. I probably tend to feed less than other keepers do. Animals that are lean and trim and muscular tend to be happier and healthier and better breeders. So, I don't really power feed them at all. The females will get a little bit more in the, after laying their eggs.
Okay. And now talking about laying eggs, what's the average clutch size and how does it vary through the species?
Good. So that depends a lot. The indigos tend to have larger eggs, but smaller clutches. Whereas the cribos will tend to have smaller eggs, but larger clutches. So you can have yellowtail cribos, blacktail cribos that'll lay 15 to 20 eggs on the upper end. Sometimes it's more like, 12, somewhere in that area. But they tend to, they can pump them out. Whereas the indigos, Eastern indigos, and Texans and the Mexicans, they tend to be more like somewhere from between 6 and 12, something along those lines. It can be more, obviously, with individuals here and there, but bigger eggs, larger hatchlings, but smaller clutches on the indigos. Cribos, the babies are small. They're a little bit thinner and wiry, and not quite as robust when they're first born. But it's a function of having a lot of eggs that are smaller in a clutch.
And how difficult is it then to get these guys started? And what is your process?
Well, that's kind of the question, right? It's not very easy, to be honest with you, and that's part of why breeding indigos and cribos is not for everybody. It is a process because they're such prey generalists in the wild. You often don't really know what they want when they're first born. And so some species are easier to get started than others on average. But again, obviously it varies by individual. Texas indigos tend to be the easiest. They'll tend to go to rodents right off the bat without a whole lot of struggle. But Easterns and some of the cribos, sometimes you get clutches that go straight to rodents and other times they're a real pain. And so scenting and other techniques are, things that we use. But a technique that might work on one snake might not work on the next. And so you sort of have to have a wide array of different strategies to be able to get them all feeding. And you go back earlier in our conversation about my first clutch of blacktail cribo eggs. That was the learning curve. That was the stressful part, was getting all the babies feeding, because sometimes the baby wants fish. Sometimes it wants frog. Sometimes it wants lizard. Sometimes it wants bird, and it can be a process. But generally speaking, some scenting items will work better than others. Fish is usually our go-to, and so we'll take a pinky and scent it with fish scent, and that will often work. They'll hunt off of scent, but they also use their vision more than other snakes too. So I'll use live pinkies or fuzzies often. Scenting them with fish, feeding them actually fish works well. That usually solves the problem with fish, but sometimes I need to resort to other scents. But it can take a while.
So do you just keep like the biggest variety of food in your freezer? I mean, I'm just thinking
my
you gotta
freezer
have
is very interesting.
You gotta have frog. You gotta have. I just can imagine the different.
I have all of that in my freezer. I have snakes. I have lizards. I have frogs. I have chicks. I have quail.
You just have a dead zoo in there.
I have fish. Yep. So all of that. So it takes time. It takes patience. It takes a lot of record keeping. When you have 200 baby Drymarchon, you have to keep track of where everyone's feeding status is. So feeding cards for everything, and that can be time consuming and take a lot of work. So the process itself can take a few months to get them, fully established. Generally speaking, though, the genus as a whole, they're very intense feeders and they're very aggressive feeders. And so once you kind of get that, feeding response going, it's generally not a problem, and they'll eat anything you throw in front of them for the most part. So it's just developing that in the hatchling, and once you get that going, then you have it. But what I tend to look for is not quite as much how many meals has it eaten and how many pinkies has it eaten, but more it's an attitude and it's a behavior. And you'll see it with adults and with sub-adults that they own their area. And when you open their cage or you go into their enclosure and they're thinking, I'm going to get fed, and it's not just that they'll flash out and bite at anything, but they'll immediately pick their head up and they'll start searching and they'll start looking, and there's a different breathing pattern. They sort of huff and just kind of like that when they're looking around their cage looking for food. But once they sort of develop that sort of intensity, then I know they're ready to go to a new home, and they're not going to be a problem feeding for my buyers or whatever it's going to be. So sometimes they'll sort of timidly eat 7 or 8 meals and whatever, but it's when they start really going berserk that I know that they're not going to be a problem for people.
Brandon Sander in the chat asked, what kind of fish do you use for scenting?
Good question. So it does make a difference. Trout works really well. So I'll use trout. I have a friend of mine who's an avid fisherman, and he just sort of saves his trout, and it works well. And those you can cut them up into fillets. However, out of convenience sake, what works well that we use a lot of are called silver sides, which you can buy frozen at Petco or PetSmart, or I don't know what pet things you have, and they're generally used as feeder fish for other fish, for tropical fish. And I buy them frozen in blocks, and they're basically like a large guppy, 2-3 inches long, and that works well too, because I'll scent with that, and if they don't eat the scented pinky, then they'll often just eat the fish itself. And for a hatchling snake, that's the perfect size. So that works well too. But catfish fillets, tilapia fillets, any of those will be things that they could potentially go after. But we use silver sides a lot. A lot of that's out of convenience, and it is effective.
Yeah. I was wondering, because I know for me in particular, like I want that to be one of the last steps, is going to the actual prey item that I'm scenting with, because I'm afraid that's going to get stuck on that. Are you afraid that you're going to have a baby get stuck on fish, or is it establishing that food response and then you're good?
It's establishing the food response and then you're good. It does happen, obviously, but it is rare to have a larger indigo or cribo only want a certain prey item. Generally speaking, once you get that food response going and you get that sort of territorial dominating attitude that they have towards their environment, they'll eat anything you put in front of them, for the most part. So it's really just kind of developing that. I've never had one that only wanted fish and never wanted rodents. Once you get the feeding response going, sometimes it'll take a few months of just eating fish, and just, I had a snake once that was, and this was an anomaly, but it was several months of, it would just turn its nose up to any kind of pinky, but if I just put a spot of fish scent on the pinky's nose, it would slam it. But that's not really the norm. Once they really kind of get that aggressive feeding response, they'll eat anything. I don't worry about them getting stuck on a certain prey item.
Mm-hmm.
So from this is a particular question. So do you ramp up your purchases of that variety of stuff right when babies are about to hatch, or does it kind of have the same amount of the frog, the fish, all year round?
No, I definitely need to prepare for hatchling season. It's My busy time of year is August through October, because that's not only when I'm handling getting all the babies feeding, but that's also when I'm, managing customers and getting, the snakes sold, of the ones that I'm not going to keep for myself. And so that's the busy time of year, and I need to kind of prepare for that. So it works pretty well for me for the first part of that window, in that I'm a teacher for my day job. And so I have my summers off, which is why I'm able to talk to you guys I guess we're towards the end of the day.
Are y'all already out of school?
I'm already out. Yeah, my school district gets out kind of early. This is my actual first day of summer break. So
mine's not until next week. Well, the kids are done. I have staff week this week, and so we're done next week.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've got a few meetings to do next week, but yeah, so it allows me I try to get as much done as I can before I have to go back to work in the fall. That's the busiest time of the school year for a teacher as well, kind of August, September. So those couple months are really insane for me. And it's handling emails and managing people and requests and things like that gets pretty crazy. So I try to stay organized with the record keeping. I try to stay organized within my email folders and who wants what and all that kind of thing. And you got to write everything down. And in addition to that, you need to manage the animals and keep track of what snakes are eating what. And if this snake is eating a fish and this one wants lizard and that kind of thing, it can be a lot of work.
Absolutely.
You need like stickers.
Well, speaking of like
I use coded to colored stickers for everything. So if a snake is feeding well, it gets a certain color sticker. If it's sold and reserved by somebody, it gets another color sticker. And all my tubs for all my hatchlings are just covered with stickers.
Now, talking about selling the animals, I mean, you're dealing with, at least with the Eastern Indigos, something that you need a federal permit, from my understanding, to get out of your state. Right. So what kind of hoops do you have to jump through? Does the customer have to jump through? Do you need to help them along the process? And just tell us all about that.
Yeah, so that is a deterrent for some people. A lot of people don't want to deal with the permits. It's actually not that bad, particularly if you're diligent in the way you put together your application. And I absolutely help customers with that kind of thing. But the way the legalities work is, anytime you want to move an Eastern Indigo snake that's part of a transaction from one state to another, you need to obtain the federal interstate commerce permit. And that's available on the internet, and I share a link with potential buyers. But it costs $100, and it usually involves a 2 or 3 month processing time.
Wow.
But, like with any kind of I don't want to talk too bad about federal agencies, but things can get gummed up in the work. So that's part of the process, is just kind of staying on top of people of the office and making sure that things are getting processed correctly. But that's in order to move it from one state to another state. Now,
right.
If you are moving from one state to another and it's not involving a transaction, you don't need the permit. But if you're trading for an animal or you're purchasing an animal, you need to get the permit. So
what happens if you move and then you sell it in that state? Then I guess
if it's that's not tricky. Technically an issue. I mean, there are obviously a lot of ways that people try to get around the permit. Yeah. I'm generally a real stickler for making sure that things are done properly. If I know that you're out of state, I make you get the permit. There are people that ask if they can drive to California and come pick it up to avoid the process. I tell them no. It's just not worth it for me. You may as well just do it and do it right. As far as the permit goes, it's not worth the risk. So with that being said, as far as ownership of the animal, that's up to the state. The feds cannot regulate what you own or don't own. That's up to state law. So most states you can own Eastern Indigos without a problem. The states where it can get sticky is where they're indigenous. So Georgia, for example, you can't own them unless you get a state permit, which is generally only issued to educational facilities. But Florida has kind of changed their stance on it, which has been kind of interesting. and this only happened a couple of years ago, but they stopped issuing state permits to own eastern indigos. And so what they do now is you can own them, but you have to prove that it was legally acquired from a captive breeding facility. And the way that they do that is you have to obtain your federal interstate commerce permit. And that shows that you bought it from an out-of-state breeder and that it's a captive bred animal. So a Florida resident can purchase an animal from me without me having to jump through any hoops on the state level. They just have to make sure that when they get that federal interstate commerce permit, that they keep it and have it ready to show and have handy, that if they ever get inspected or if there's ever an issue, they can say, look, here's my documentation to prove this is a legally acquired animal.
But what if they buy it in the state of Florida? Wouldn't they then not need the?
Now, I am a little bit ignorant to how the state regs work as far as buying and selling within the state. I would imagine that's restricted, but I don't know for sure. I also don't know. I've not yet learned what happens if you breed eastern indigos in Florida. What do you do with the offspring, and how all of that works? So I don't know. I don't know the answers to those questions yet. But obviously, Florida's main ambition is to make sure that you're not taking them out of the wild, and that you can prove that whatever it is that you have was legally acquired. So, my understanding is if you have an eastern indigo in your house, you have to be able to show that it was acquired through a federal interstate commerce permit.
And is there anything that you have to do to prove your legitimacy to the
state
of
actually,
Florida?
No. And actually, as far as permits go, there's really nothing that I have to do. It's the buyer's responsibility to be able to get the interstate commerce permit if they live outside of California. That being said, I help them through the process and give advice and on how to fill out the application to lead to as little red tape as possible. But as far as owning them in California and selling them, I don't have any responsibility with the government on that.
Okay, that's fair enough. And this is obviously a lot of people's dream animal is an eastern indigo, and I've seen so many giant, docile, amazing indigos. Like you were saying, they obviously have a pretty good food response. Is that something that you don't open the tub and put your hand in there immediately? You just got to get them out and they're chill, or are they that smart that they can visually tell the difference?
Well, a lot of people do talk about the quote unquote intelligence of an indigo snake. It's obviously a difficult thing to quantify, and you don't really understand it until you own one and you work with it every day. But part of what I see as their intelligence is that they've got this insane feeding response. But once you get them out and they're in your hands, they know that they're not being fed, and they figure it out very quickly. Other snakes, not as much. I've had king snakes, I'm sure you have as well, that if they feel something fleshy, they're going to bite it, without much thought. But indigo snakes figure it out pretty quickly. That being said, it varies by individual. There are some cages that I know that I can't go into without care because they'll come flying out with their mouth open. And there are others where it's not as big of an issue. But as a general procedural rule of thumb, I use a cage hook with all of my adults. And I'll go in with the long hook, I'll pull them out, and as soon as I get a coil in my hand, they know it's over, and they're a docile snake from that point, for the most part. But yeah, I've got some animals that are pretty intense, particularly in the summer when the temperatures are a little bit warmer. And they're pretty jacked up, and there are snakes that absolutely lunge out with their mouth open. I have a yellow-tailed Cribo, and in fact, there's a video somewhere on YouTube of my largest yellow-tailed Cribo is over 8 feet long. In the summertime, he will launch out of his cage, and I have to have an escape route, because he lands on the floor, this full, 8-foot mass, and will chase me across the room until I can get a rat in his mouth. So I have long forceps that I have a rat, dangling from, and it's never been a problem. He's never actually got me, but the game is I got to get a rat in his mouth before he gets a body part of mine in his mouth. But he's a gentle, docile snake. He just gets hungry, and as soon as soon as he knows he's not being fed, which doesn't take very long,
a snake chasing you, you're out of the gentle, docile. I can't still put it in that box if it's gonna chase you. Like,
no, well, I understand, but it's it's the kind of thing you just sort of have to see. There's a large sector of the snake culture and hobby where people like intense snakes like that. But again, you can. Once I use a cage hook and I pull the snake out and he knows he's not being fed, we're buddies. He's a pretty chill animal. But that's the other neat thing about, we talked earlier about that indigo snakes and cribos are not constrictors. It's a hard thing to sort of describe, but a lot of constrictors, their thing is they'll strike, they'll bite, and then they'll pull the animal in to its coils and wrap around the prey item. These guys don't do that. It's not just jaw strength and bite, but it's also just blunt force trauma. I mean, they'll take their head and they'll smash into the prey item, and they don't just grab it; they drive through it and they push it, and they'll actually hit it with their head in their mouth as part of a way to subdue their prey. And so they don't bite like that; they plow through things, and so. They charge. They don't just strike and walk away. They charge their prey, which is it keeps you on your toes in the summertime when it's a little hot out. But again, I don't want to over dramatize the intensity of the animals. But more often than not, they're super chill animals, and they will hang out and they're cool.
Yeah, I don't think you are.
You're not. We just pulled up the video you were talking about. You're not over drama. Like, my face is still like, what the fuck? That thing leaped so far out of his cage.
Yeah, he's a good snake. That is a regular occurrence for me. If I don't have time or I'm not in the mood to dance, I just open his cage that much and slide a little rat in there.
He's out.
But if I'm, I'll show him off to friends now and again when I'm feeding, and I'll open it up and it doesn't take much coaxing. He comes out and chases you.
It's like one of the things you used to spin as a kid and like pop out. You know what I'm talking about? The little box. Like that's what it reminds me of. Like
they pop out. I take care to not get bitten because it is pretty intense. But the worst bite that I ever took was I was careless and I went into one of my higher up drawers that had an indigo in it, and it was super gentle snake that I let my kids play with. But I was checking to see if he'd eaten, and I pulled open the drawer and I peeked up and in like that, and all I saw was just white gums coming at me, and it hit me right on the nose and just ripped. And my obviously reaction was to jerk back, I had just slash marks across my nose, and it was bleeding all over the place and whatever. But it's the feeding response. It's something to watch out for sure. It's a lot of fun, but again,
not the word I would use.
I would venture to say hopefully a lot of your listeners would disagree in that, it keeps you on your toes. And a lot of people sort of gravitate to that kind of attitude and intelligence, but at the same time, it's an intimidating snake. But at the same time, you hold them in your hands, and they can be pretty gentle. So that's what's really neat about them.
It's wild how after it got the item, you're able to pick it up and put it back in its tub with no.
They don't care about me at all. Once they have food in their mouth, it doesn't matter. It's and that's the other thing too, is that other snakes you'll see, they might pop out of their cage and grab a rat and pull it back in. Mm-hmm. These guys don't do that. Even if they grab the rat, 2 inches from the opening of its cage, they still push their whole body out. So it's a regular occurrence for me to have to pick up an 8-foot snake that landed on the floor because it grabbed a rat and then just kept pushing forward. And
even though the rat was 2 inches from its face, it still was like, no, I'm going to go full distance.
They plow right through it, and they pop out of the cage. But once they have a prey item in their mouth, they are not concerned about me at all. They just want it. They just want to eat and gobble it down as fast as possible so they can get on to the next one.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I play that game with my olive python, and I need to make sure that she's not. Sometimes she'll be in the front, and then I have to bang on the back, and then she'll like get her attention over there, and then I just throw the rat in there. I don't even fucking and I close it. Like, get out of here. But in the chat they were talking about we've heard of certain things with heat intolerance with Cribos. Could you explain a little bit about that? How you can't get too hot, or what temperatures you keep them at?
Well, so talking about just sort of basic maintenance, they're not horribly difficult snakes to keep as long as you kind of stick to a couple factors. First of which is water. The Drymarchon genus is going to drink more than any snake you've kept. At least I haven't come across anything comparable. So access daily to fresh water is really important. And if you sort of neglect a cage and go out of town for whatever, if they go without water for a week or two, most snakes are fine with that. But with indigo snakes, that can cause permanent organ damage. And you might come home from being out of town and find the snake a little thin. And even if it drinks and starts eating again, they could roll over on you a month later. It does damage their organs. So, daily fresh water is really important. That's something that you cannot neglect. Secondly is the temperature, that they are not tolerant of warm temperatures, despite being on average sort of a tropical species. They don't like warm temperatures, and it will stress them out. It'll dehydrate them faster than normal, and it can be a problem. So generally speaking, you want to keep them on the high side of room temperature, but not much warmer. And so, heat lamps, heat bulbs, that kind of thing is really not necessary. It kind of depends on the ambient temperature in your room. I find that they do really well if you just keep the ambient temperature 78 degrees, 80 degrees maybe, and no heat at all. And just leave it like that. If your ambient temperature in your room is more in the low 70s, they're fine, but digesting meals can be tricky. So you do want to put kind of a hot spot way off in one corner, under tank heater, whatever you want to do. But keep it way off to one corner, and even then put a thermostat on it and keep it in, not any more than 83 degrees, something like that, because if it gets much more, they will stress out. So a lot of keepers, just with the way they have the room set up, should not own Drymarchon because their rooms just get too warm. If your room is in the summertime is going to be in the mid 80s, or the upper 80s, that might be fine for a ball python, but it's not good for an indigo. It'll kill it. So if you keep the temperatures appropriate, and if you keep the fresh water in there, those are the two most major factors in keeping a Drymarchon snake happy.
And what are considerations as far as like bedding or hides or anything like that? Is any of that? Are there any do's or don'ts, or what do you do?
So there is a lot of variability in what Drymarchon breeders use for bedding. One of the big factors is odor control. And so we alluded to this a little earlier, but they poop often, and their poops are a lot different than other snakes.
Ew.
Not to get too graphic for your listeners, but you're not talking about a log here. You're talking about a spray of liquidy, kind of like wet cement kind of glue. And it can be kind of grainy, that kind of thing. And they don't just leave it and lay it. It does, in fact, spray. So actually seeing it on the side of the cage is common, and it does not smell great, particularly if you're mixing in fish. Fish is an occasional supplement for my guys. I don't feed them a lot of that because that does make it even stinkier. So odor control is a factor that Drymarchon keepers have to think about, particularly if you're keeping them in the house, where the odor is not as, well received by your spouse or whatever it is. But what I use is I use aspen shavings that are ground very fine, so I don't have to worry about any kind of impaction. And then I mix into that compressed wood pellets, and I buy them in bulk from feed stores, and people use them in horse stables because it absorbs odor and it absorbs liquid very well. So it's naturally dehumidifying. But what happens when any kind of liquid hits it, is that, it starts off as a pellet, and then when liquid hits it, it sort of, turns into sort of like more of a grainy powder, and it just absorbs all of it. So that's really great for absorbing the moisture of the poop and the odor of the poop. So I mix that in with the aspen shavings, and that's helpful.
So does it turn into like kitty litter? When you say grainy,
it's not so much that it clumps like a kitty litter would do. It's more that it expands and spreads out and breaks apart. Instead of a compressed pellet, it breaks apart, and it absorbs it as it goes. So that right there is naturally dehumidifying, which and these snakes, need a certain amount of humidity as well. I also don't live in a very humid climate in Southern California anyway, so I provide humid hide boxes for the animals. So all of them have a hide box that they can fit into that's filled with damp moss, and they sit in there most often, particularly when they're going to shed. So that's the way I do things. Other keepers do things differently. Other people will use cocoa mulch or something like that will absorb moisture pretty well. I know of a guy that uses pellets that are made for ferrets, and it's made out of paper products, which I actually I've had in my mind that I want to experiment with that as well. But it's the same idea as the wood pellets. It's just compressed paper, and so they'll keep them on that. That does a good job as well. And some people are very fastidious, and they want a really clean thing, and they don't want to worry about any kind of bacteria in the substrate or whatever. So some people will use newspaper. I can't bring myself to do that because, you can dump it, but you're literally cleaning every other day. And
that's what I was about to ask. How often are you having to completely, take out all the bedding and refill it?
Well, it depends on the bedding, right? If you're using newspaper, you're cleaning every other day because that's the poops are very liquidy and it's messy. But when you're using, the pellets, that kind of thing, you can spot clean weekly and then do a deep clean once a month kind of a thing.
Oh, that's not bad. Okay.
So it's not terrible. And obviously, the volume of poop depends on the volume of feeding. So it's less in the winter time. But it is an issue, but it's not insurmountable. You just kind of have to play with what works best for you and what makes sense for you in your stateroom, and controlling the odor is something you definitely have to keep in mind with indigos for sure.
Do you know, are these a particular wood or a blend of wood? And then also, do they have like an odor to them?
There's not an odor to them. The stuff I buy, and actually I believe the stuff I buy is pine, which people do say, that you need to avoid. I've been using it for many years without an issue. But again, I mix it in with the aspen bedding, and it is actually a very small percentage of what's in there. You don't need a whole lot of pellets for it to actually do its job of odor control. But that's also why I've been fiddling around with the idea of trying out the paper product. But I believe it is pine. But again, I've never had an issue. It's not as toxic as cedar or something like that you definitely don't want to use.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, Eastern indigos come from the longleaf pine forest. So wouldn't you think they're in pine like constantly?
Well, yeah. I mean, you would think, but if you're keeping them in a cage where they're surrounded by it, it's a different scenario. But
without ventilation, stuff like that.
Yeah, but again, I've never had a problem. I've never had a problem using that. It's worked well for me.
And do you think, I mean, since they seem to be easily started on fish, I mean, is that a thing that they may, spend a lot of time in the water?
I have actually not spent really nearly as much time as I would like actually looking for Drymarchon in the wild. I'm familiar with their preferred habitat for the Eastern indigos, in the Southeast U.S. I will say that a lot of the stories that I hear about people finding black-tailed Cribos and things in Central America is that you do find them often hunting around the edges of water. So I would imagine that's kind of a thing, but I think that will, depend a bit on species and depend a little bit on the microhabitat, that they're, the Eastern indigos in the Southeast are using a lot of the tortoise burrows, and they prefer sort of the sandy, long pine kind of thing. But I know in Central America, I have heard it's definitely a thing if you want to look for the Cribos is to look around water.
Now, besides getting the Easterns cooler, are there any differences between all of them as far as, like we mentioned before, heat tolerance and then keeping just in general?
I keep them all the same. There are some people that will tell you that some of the South American, Central American Cribos you keep a little warmer and so forth, but I really keep them all the same. The only thing I do differently is I just cool the Easterns down more in the wintertime. But the substrate, the caging, the temperature, the humidity, I keep them all the same. It's all pretty uniform, and it's been pretty successful with them all. So I generally tell people just, the one care sheet on my website will work for all the species.
Now, I mean, everyone loves Drymarchon, but doesn't seem to be like an absorbent amount of people working with them. Why do you think that is, or at least breeding them successfully?
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing. They're not a beginner snake, as you mentioned it kind of at the beginning of the show. I think their size and their intensity is it's alluring to some people, but it's not for everybody. They're generally not the kind of snake that you're going to buy for your 10-year-old kid. That's kind of more in the corn snake, king snake arena. So it's not for everybody. But that being said, I've sold several hundred over the last decade, and you don't see a lot of people turning around and breeding them years later, and so I don't know that it's difficulty in how to care for them or if it's breeding them. I know it is not as simple as you would think, particularly with Eastern Indigos and actually successfully getting fertile and healthy babies. So it's not the easiest thing to do, and I think that does kind of limit the amount of people that are actually producing healthy babies every year. So it's the kind of thing where, if you can figure it out and you're doing it correctly, it can be productive for you, but it's not really something that you want to, bank on being able to get, consistent clutches every year until you've had a lot of experience in kind of doing it.
Absolutely. Do you have a question?
Yeah, but I'm trying to figure out how to say it and make it not sound stupid.
Oh, no. There you go.
I don't know how to
say the stupid question.
Well, I know when we first started dating and I would see pictures all the time, I would think something was an MBK and it was an Eastern Indigo.
Well,
and I was wondering if he runs into that, like people reaching out to him thinking he has MBKs, but I just don't know if that's a thing.
No, it's not a stupid question. People do come to me just sort of figuring that I work with all black snakes. So I do have people coming to look for Mexican black kings occasionally, even though they're not anywhere on my website or, anything like that. But it happens. It happens. I do tend to gravitate towards the all black snakes. Years ago, I bred black milled snakes for a while. I don't anymore, but and then I work with Mussurana as well, which is an all black snake. So, but yeah, it happens.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the hobby, a lot of people consider, black pines or MBKs the poor man's indigo.
Yeah.
So,
which I think is messed up.
But I think it should be a black.
I mean, the phrase "poor man" sort of, suggests something about price, and there's certainly a price difference between a Mexican black king and an indigo snake. But the Mexican black kings are a lot of fun. Those are really neat snakes too. My opinion is obviously very biased, but an indigo snake is a whole nother level of animal.
Do you think that's why it's so much more expensive?
No. People ask me that a lot, particularly when you vend the reptile shows and say, "Why is that snake $1,000?" But it's like anything else, in business. It's basic economics. The price of an animal is supply and demand, and if you have very few breeders and a lot of people that want it, you can get away with asking for more money. And there are a lot of people that sort of think differently and think that, that the price tag on an animal should be a function of how colorful or how cool or how neat the animal is, when it's really not. It's a function of how many people want it versus how many people are offering it. So, and again, that kind of goes back to what you were saying, Joe, about, about not having a whole lot of other breeders out there. That's part of the deal. If everyone were breeding indigo snakes as easily and readily as they do corn snakes, they wouldn't be worth or they wouldn't be sold for as much as they are. So, and historically they weren't. They used to be a lot cheaper. So, it's just a function of the market, and it's a function of supply and demand.
And now I guess we should clear up what are the typical prices for each one of the species.
Well, I've pretty. I don't really play around with it too much. Indigos, Eastern indigos, I ask $1,000 per individual, and there are different color phases. There's what people call the black phase, and then the red throat phase. And the demand for one versus the other, might vary a little bit, not by a ton, but I generally just price everything the same with Eastern indigos. Some of the other indigos, the Mexicans and the Texans, I just try to gauge it off of how many I produce every year. I don't really worry too much about other breeders and what other breeders are doing and what other breeders are asking for. I tend to sell out of my animals very easily. So I don't really worry if someone else is out there selling it for less. It's going to happen here and there, but by and large, it's kind of a question of what I sold the year previous. How well did they sell? Did they sell well for that price? And then how many am I producing this year? Did all of my females produce? Did only a couple of my females produce? I might have a year where I only have 10 to offer, and I might have a year where I have 50 to offer. But that being said, I generally keep my prices pretty stable. They haven't changed a whole lot in the last 12 years. Like I said, I've never really had too much of an issue selling stuff. So, the Eastern indigos, I'm more in the $1,000 range. The Mexican red tail indigos are still less common, with less supply out there than the Easterns. So I price them a little bit higher. The Texans are, the demand is still nice and high on those. In fact, they go for nearly as much as the Easterns, whereas they used to be cheaper. But, again, low supply, high demand. And the Cribos tend to be a little bit less because they do have larger clutch sizes. So there tends to be, some supply out there. And those tend to be more, in the $400 or $500 area, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important to know. I mean, just ask someone who bought $1,000 ball python 12 years ago or whatever, if they're still the same. So,
yeah, well, the market does. If you want to look at it from a business perspective, the market doesn't really fluctuate with Drymarchon as much as some of the morph markets do. Whether you're talking about the ball pythons or hognose snakes or whatever else, you don't see that. You don't see that fluctuation. You don't see prices skyrocketing or dropping down to almost nothing. Within 2 years, it doesn't really happen. So. And part of it is that there aren't really any morphs other than the xanthic blacktail. So just you've got a wild type snake with the wild type look, and it's basic supply and demand, and so the market is generally pretty stable. If anything, demand has increased over the last few years because of just sort of awareness, and the just internet and social media has kind of brought exposure to them, which certainly helps in that regard. So, yeah, it's not the kind of thing where you worry about all of a sudden 2 years from now an Eastern indigo is going to be $200. This is just not going to happen. But that being said, what I advise people a lot is that if this is an investment for you because you want to make money and you want to get a clutch of babies that you're going to sell. Like we mentioned earlier, Drymarchon are not the easiest thing to breed, and unless your experience level is kind of on par with what's necessary, you don't want to look at it as a business investment. What I tell people is, look, if you want to spend $1,000 on a really cool pet, go for it. Spend the money. But if you're wanting to, make money and spend $1,000 on something that's an investment for your future or whatever else, you might want to look somewhere else. Because it's not a slam dunk to be able to successfully breed any type of Drymarchon snake. So, it's something to think about. Is what are your motivations in spending that money? Do you just want really cool animals that maybe you can breed? Then great. But if you're trying to build some kind of reptile breeding business or whatever else, it's not a slam dunk. And it's a lot of money, to invest. So I often, believe it or not, I often counsel people to not buy my snakes.
Interesting. Yeah. We are definitely not in that business. Kind of backtracking a little bit. Someone asked in the chat if you sell internationally, and if not, do you know anyone who sells?
Or is it even possible to ship in Eastern Indigo or something like that internationally?
So I can ship any of my Drymarchon without problem, except for Eastern Indigos. Eastern Indigos, because they're listed as threatened on the Endangered Species Act, I cannot export those. So that's all just domestic sales. That being said, all the other Drymarchon species, the other major 5, the Cribos and the Mexican Indigos and the Texas Indigos, I ship those worldwide. Yeah.
And what is your collection as far as size goes? How many adult animals do you have, breeding pairs, and how many clutches do you hope to have, or what are your percentages usually on a typical year of how many actually go?
Well, that's the other nice thing about having a partner with his own facility is that, I've got half of Black Pearl's Drymarchon are at his house. So, but generally speaking, he and I both have roughly about 30 adults Drymarchon each at any given time. Then we have all of our holdbacks that, younger animals that we're raising up. And then obviously hatchling season, your numbers go through the roof. So in any given year, it kind of depends on what our goals are, and what we're trying to do. Like I said, the Cribos have larger clutch sizes. So it kind of depends on what percentage of our adults are Cribos that are breeding that year or whatever. But generally speaking, we end up somewhere in the 150 to 200, baby Drymarchon every year. And there's variability. Sometimes females don't produce, or they produce infertile eggs that year. That happens now and again. And and obviously, we've been in the game long enough that they're retired breeders that move out, and younger ones that come in, and that kind of thing, which affects all the fertility. And every summer we go through and kind of look at what our clutches are and what our adults look like, and how many of each species of Drymarchon, do we want to have? How many do we want to be producing every year? And so we'll sometimes, thin the herd a little bit with our adults every year, just kind of reevaluate our breeding groups. But, we like to have a nice sized and consistently producing breeding group of all 6 of the major Drymarchon going every year. So it can fluctuate. Some years are big years. Last year was crazy. There were just a lot of baby snakes, but so it varies. But you have to be prepared every fall to just be swamped in babies.
Yeah, I mean that's a significantly sized collection, especially for the size of snake. And I saw that now switching over, I saw that you did have a pied Mussurana lay. So is that a new project for you? Are Mussuranas new, or are you always?
You know what? Them? It's actually an old one, believe it or not. I was into Mussurana a long time ago, and I actually was part of importing some of the first ones into the United States. There was a guy in Washington who was importing them from a breeder in Uruguay for a few years, and then he didn't want to do it anymore, and I sort of took over. And so the piebald Mussurana came from a breeder in Uruguay, and he's actually just now started sending animals to the U.S. again. But I used to import them into the U.S., and I keep a few for myself and sell the rest off. And I got out of that after a while. And the Mussurana, are even more work than the Drymarchon babies, and it got to be pretty overwhelming for me. So I actually got out of the project altogether several years ago, and I missed them. And so I just got one pair back, and so I have a pair of piebald, just one pair of piebald Mussurana that I breed now, which is a really neat snake and a really cool trait that with the way it presents itself. So yeah, I find just, some of the kind of side projects that I do in addition to the Drymarchon, I kind of come and go with some of them. And there are some that I just miss. In this past year, I kind of got nostalgic and wanted to kind of work with projects that I used to work with and got out of. And so that was the Mussurana and some of the Barons racers.
Now, those type of things, do you totally change up how you're keeping for them in particular, or do you keeping them the same as the others?
No, I mean, that's the other thing too. It's when I'm thinking about projects to take on, I have to be mindful of what the ambient temperatures are in my room and what I can handle as far as care goes. So, I'm deliberately keeping things, projects that work well under Drymarchon type husbandry, and Mussurana absolutely fall in that category. Temperature, humidity, all that kind of thing is very similar with the Mussurana. So that it's an easy transition to be able to do those. Yeah.
Right. Are you familiar with the Terry Phillip method? The fact that he keeps everything at 80 degrees. I do it for a lot of my snakes besides my Australian stuff, but do you believe that to be effective, or do you think that may just work for the snakes that you tend to keep?
Well, I'm not familiar with that name. However, that method is something that we absolutely employ. Keeping our snake rooms at 78, 80 degrees and not applying any heat is a good way to go. It also, leads to less risk as far as a heating malfunction or thermostat malfunction. Mm-hmm. But that being said, it works really well for what we have because they don't need to get warmer. I don't know what you would do with a ball python or something. I would assume you would need to add supplemental heat in addition to the 80 degrees. But 78, 80 degrees is absolutely perfect for what we have. And having a room that's temperature controlled like that is absolutely effective.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for me, I just do it not to light on fire as well. So
well,
that's always good.
Fires and reptiles don't mix.
Yeah. And you see it far, far, far too often. So it's definitely something that you got to be cognizant of.
I have a question that's different subject. So do you have one still?
No,
and you may have talked about it before I got here, but I want to know how kind of your partnership works. What, is it if you make a sale, you get the money, he gets a sale, do you split everything? How does it,
Well, we have a very good arrangement. We're very good friends. We trust and understand each other perfectly. We don't have any disagreements on how things are kept or how things should go, which is step one. And we've been working together for a decade now, and so it works very well on that regard. As far as sort of the business side of it goes, it only works well because we have that understanding. So in actuality, I handle all of the sales, and he doesn't handle any. And part of that's intentional,
know your strengths.
He's actually. It's interesting because he's actually a very talented talker and salesperson, but he's also the kind of guy that would give you the shirt off his back. And so before he and I met, he would just sort of give snakes away to friends, kind of thing. But I don't do bro prices. It's more scaled like a business. But that being said, he does half the care and keeps half the animals. I keep the other half. And he takes care of his expenses at his house. I take care of mine at my house. If we're going to purchase new animals, we split it 50-50. When I sell animals, I collect all the money. I give him half. Then and then sort of trade off for that, he handles all the veterinary work. Anything that pops up, any kind of quarantining that needs to happen, it goes through him. If there are there's usually a certain percentage of the babies every year that don't respond to the easiest of the scenting and that sort of feeding techniques, and those are ones that I just send to his house and let him work on. So he does some of the more intense and specialized labor.
That's a good trade-off.
And I handle all the sales. So it's an arrangement that works well for us, and again, it's something that's just built on the trust and relationship that we have with each other. So it works out well. We don't have anything in writing. Everything is just done and understanding that he knows what I'm doing and I know what he's doing, and it's just a mutual trust. We talk several times a week. He lives 15 minutes from my house.
I was just about to ask that. I feel like you would have to be close.
We get together often, not just socially, but to exchange animals here and there and pick things up and drop things off. And our kids play together, our wives hang out. It's a pretty good situation.
How long have you guys been working together?
He said a decade.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, if you haven't said that before. Yeah, sometimes I'm reading the chat and
you're not listening.
Right.
So basically, neither of you are allowed to move though for this to continue.
Well, things would have to change a little bit. It would, we'd make it work. But I'm not planning on moving. He's not planning on moving, and so for now, it's just a good situation, and it's hopefully not going to change.
Well, you missed in the beginning that his partner actually has a herd of Galapagos tortoises, so I don't think he's moving anywhere. So
no, it's a little difficult to move 400-pound animals.
Do you ever worry about car rides with those picky babies?
No, not really. No, I just put them in a deli cup and go meet up with them.
Yeah, because there's a certain amount of people who actually it's a thing among Grintry people that they actually take their babies on car rides in order to jumble up whatever's going on, and it will make them eat, supposedly. So
now I've heard of that with human babies to get them to fall asleep, but I don't know about. I hadn't heard that. I don't mean to be dismissive of it, but I will say that sometimes with picky feeding babies, that sometimes a change of environment does help. There are times when I'll send a snake that I cannot get feeding over to his house, and within 2 days he's got it feeding, and vice versa. Sometimes he has trouble with something, and he'll take it to my house, and it switches on for whatever reason. So we haven't figured out what to attribute that other than just a change of environment. So I don't know about the car ride, but but the house and the caging can make a difference.
So does he keep the exact same way that you keep?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And now I know you talked about experimenting with some different bedding. Is it an understanding like that? Oh, if you start going this way, like he would do it too, or?
Well, it's not so much an understanding like that. It's more just that we bounce ideas off each other all the time, and so we're always chatting about that sort of thing. And it's interesting because particularly early on in our relationship, that that he would sort of stumble across a husbandry technique, and I would sort of stumble across it at the same time. And we, because we're always thinking and we're always learning and we're always chatting with each other. And, that's another really beneficial part to, our business relationship, is that we're always analyzing, we're always thinking, we're always learning, we're always researching, and we're always sharing ideas with each other. And, if he figures out something that works really well, I'll try it. If it works for me, then we go with it. And if it doesn't work for me, then he does it and I don't, and that's fine. He's successful with what he keeps, and I'm successful with what I keep. And more often than not, our husbandry aligns with that, and just his stuff tends to be the same as mine. But that's part of, a lot of what we do is just sort of been just the two of us brainstorming and talking about what's working and what's not working. And if something gets messed up, or we get a clutch of bad eggs, or something's not feeding, or if there's a health issue, whatever, and that we have that conversation, and we talk about to what do we attribute the successes, and to what do we attribute the failures, and that helps us kind of refine what we do.
Now, you mentioned before that he has a zoo background. Is there a lot of different thought between the way someone with a zoo background thinks than a hobbyist, and like what are the things that he contributes, and then also does he get ideas from hobbyists as well?
Yeah, I mean, we pull from everywhere. A lot of what we learn, we take from the zoos. And the zoos are really great at keeping certain species and keeping things well. A lot of our techniques, some of our feeding techniques, some of the other things we do are things that he learned at the zoo. But at the same time, there are also things that private keepers are doing that the zoos are not doing, and the zoos can learn a few things, as well. And so you pull from wherever you can get. we're not picky. We try not to be arrogant, and we pull whatever we can learn from anywhere we can to help take better care of our animals and help our animals be happier, healthier, and good breeders. So we're not really discriminatory along those lines.
Yeah, I think on both sides, I think ego gets involved a lot of times, and people get past what works and then would rather take something that their tribe believes in, whether it be like ball python people or this kind of people or morph people or naturalistic keepers and all that, when like maybe it just matters what works, and especially for the animals, for longevity and stuff like that.
Well, I think that's something that you can apply to really any kind of walk of life. I mean, it's being a teacher, it's the same thing. What works and what doesn't work, and when you get stuck in your ways of doing things a certain way, you're not open to new ideas. And so you have to have a certain amount of confidence in whatever you do to be successful, but at the same time you have to be open-minded and listen to other people's ideas. And that it doesn't matter if that's professionally in your work or in your hobby or in politics or whatever it is that you want to do, listening to what other people are doing and evaluating if it's going to work for you is important. And you can't let your ego get in the way. And like anything else, there are a lot of very humble and really good reptile keepers that are open to learning from other people, and there are a lot that aren't. And a lot of people that let their ego get in the way. We try not to be that. We aspire to kind of learn and listen and try things out and fiddle with things and to further refine what we're doing. So,
it's a big issue in teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Very big issue in teaching. The fight of education versus experience is a really, it's what's valued more.
Well, you're young, you don't know anything.
That's what it is. A lot of teachers say that,
Well, people, that happens in snakes too.
Right? Like,
that's true. There are people that are experience does not always equate to success, and there's something to be said for youthful passion and vigor and being open-minded. And generally speaking, younger people tend to do that more than the more experienced people. But you try to be a blend of both. You gather as much experience as you can, and certainly the longer you're doing anything, the more experienced you become. But at the same time, that's only going to take you so far. Eventually, that's going to plateau. Whether it's teaching or working with reptiles or whatever, eventually you're going to plateau, unless you are willing to listen to what other people are doing, take other people's ideas, and learn and grow. And I tell people a lot. I've been working with these things for a long time, and I found a lot of things that work for me. What works for me may not work for you. And at the same time, I'm still learning. And there are things that I'm every year, there are things that my partner and I adopt in what we do that sometimes work and sometimes don't work. But we like to think that the overall trend is moving towards things that are more successful, and staying hungry and staying motivated and staying ambitious towards being more successful in what you're doing is good. It doesn't matter if you're in the hobby for 1 year or 30 years. Just always looking for that next little edge to help you and your animals be more successful.
Right.
Speaking of being open, would you be open to keeping other species in the future?
And if you are, how does the talk between you and your partner work in order to be, hey, should we get this? Should we get that? What's going on?
Well, it's pretty straight up. I mean, generally speaking, he and I are sort of attracted to the same types of animals. There are some things that I'm into that he's not quite as into, and vice versa. There are some projects that he has that I am not invested in, that are not part of our 50-50.
Those tortoises.
Well, some of the tortoises we do together, and some of them we don't. And that's just kind of part of it. But that's more of his thing than mine. But I'm financially invested in some of those projects, but not all of them. But he and I just have an understanding with that. We're generally drawn to the same stuff. And if we want to kind of add a side project or something else, we always talk about it and talk about if it's something that would work from a husbandry standpoint, it would work from a business standpoint. And if we're not both into it, then we'll either not do it or one of us will do it, not the other. So it's, we don't argue about it too much.
Yeah, in general, you seem super focused on what you're into. I mean, pretty much exclusively a genus of snakes, but things like the Baron racers are those just, and obviously the Mussurana, you only have one pair. Are the Barons the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's I've learned to just sort of stick with the bread and butter. We've had a lot of success with the Drymarchon. I know what the market is. I know what to expect from it. I know what I can do. I know what I cannot do. For example, I've always been fascinated with Boland's pythons. I'm not going to spend the money on it, because I'm confident that I could be successful with it, but the amount of work, time, space, research, studying, tinkering that I would have to do to A, be a successful keeper, and B, hopefully potentially reproduce them someday, is more than I want to take on right now. But that being said, they're probably the species of snake that I've been most fascinated with since my childhood, but it just doesn't fit in what I do, and I don't have the time for it or the space for it. So maintaining my focus on the Drymarchon genus has been intentional because I know what it is, I know what I can expect of it, and I know what I can do, and I know what I can produce. And so I know what the market is. I know what I can sell. I have my client base. If it's not broken, don't fix it. With that being said, I like to spice it up and kind of play around with some other things. And so some of the side projects come and go. But for the most part, it's all centered around the Drymarchon. So the Barons racers are things that I used to import from the same breeder in Uruguay many years ago. Back then, it was really primarily the green ones, but there were brown ones here and there were blue ones here and there, and they were always sort of fascinated me as a really neat snake to keep. And I missed them. I missed working with them. I thought they were really neat, and I came across someone selling an adult pair of blue ones. And back when I was working with them, there were only a couple blues in the whole U.S. And I found a pair of adult blue ones. So I bought them, and I'm just enthralled with them. I absolutely love them. So it has to start there. It has to start with my passion. It has to start with what I like working with. Is it fun? Is it cool? And then the business part is sort of secondary. And if I can get both of those things to line up, then it's good. But yeah, it's intentional. I'm not using cage space to breed things that I'm going to sell for $50 each. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But it's a decision that I made that I'm going to kind of stay along things that I'm really passionate about, that I really love working with, but at the same time are somewhat financially lucrative. So, and the Barons racers are not the most pricey high-end snakes either, but they're a lot of fun to work with. They're easy to keep. They're really neat animals, and I love the kind of polymorphic thing going on with them as far as their color phases. So, yeah, and it's a space that I plan on being in for a while. But what's never going to change are the Drymarchon.
Have you successfully bred that adult pair that you picked up?
Yeah, so I bred them last year. I got a pile of babies, and I ended up kind of going a little nuts with it. It's just when I get onto a new project that I'm really enthusiastic about, I kind of go full force with it. So I accumulated a lot of other people's animals too. I got some green ones. I got some brown ones. I brought in some animals from Europe, so I've got a large breeding colony going now of blues. I'm breeding some green ones into my blue ones to see what happens there. I've got an adult trio of browns now that are hopefully going to breed this year. So this year I'm hopeful to have several clutches representing all the different color phases. So
now I've seen Baron racers all over the place, and I feel like no one's given them proper respect. I mean, people may go for a rhino rat snake or something that's pretty similar, but how many people are really captive breeding them? And then is there a lot of importation as well?
There's some, but not that much. They are. Well, I've never had a problem breeding them. In my experience, they've been pretty prolific and pretty easy to keep and pretty easy to breed. Other people have had some difficulty, but but you know, they're around, but that's part of why I wanted to get back into them is I felt like particularly the blue color phase was pretty underappreciated. And I thought with kind of the proper exposure, that it could really be a neat space to be in. So, you know, I love working with them. They're really cool snakes, but at the same time, like you said, they're around, you know, and they're not super high dollar snakes, but I don't know that they're really as fully appreciated as they could be for how neat they are and how colorful they are and the whole polymorphic nature of them. So, yeah, I'm kind of excited to see what the next couple of years holds with what I produce and what I sell and what sort of the public reaction is to them.
I know we talked a little bit about vending. You said like people would come up to you, but I'm interested, like, did y'all talk about vending before I came on? Okay. Do you vend a lot? Do most of your sales come from vending, most online? How do you decide when to vend, where to vend, all that kind of stuff?
So, you know, this is this is a hobby for me. You know, like I said, I'm a teacher full time, so I don't travel to vend. The bulk of our sales come online and just done through my computer. I only vend California shows to this point,
which is pretty good. I mean,
it's not
like you know random Idaho shows, California shows.
Right. There's some pretty big shows out here, which are a lot of fun. They're a spectacle to be sure, but yeah, I have not yet, you know, done any of the Florida shows or you know the Pennsylvania or Texas, and I've been intrigued by going to some of the shows in Germany and things like that. But, you know, I've never justified in my head the expense of traveling and hotels and bringing all my animals out there and doing all that, nor do I really have the time. So the bulk of what I do is online. I generally vend 3 shows a year. 2 of those are the Reptile Super Show in Pomona, California, which is really, I think, hands down the largest show on the West Coast. If not the country. I haven't seen, you know, I haven't really been to some of the other ones, so I can't speak too much, but it's a huge show. It's very well run, tons of people. And then I usually do the one up in Sacramento. But 3 shows a year is plenty for me.
Right. I mean, Sacramento must be a pretty big hike for you.
It's a 4 or 5 hour drive. Probably more like 5 hours depending on stops, but it's about a 5 hour drive, and I just make a weekend out of it and stay at a buddy's house. And, you know, but that's a big show. That's a lot of fun too.
Do you usually sell out?
No, I mean, I sell well, but you know, selling out with the volume of animals that I have it doesn't really happen.
Well, at the Sacramento show, earlier meant like, are you trying to only bring enough so that you're coming back with nothing? You know,
I know I've done enough of the shows to kind of reasonably know what to expect as far as volume of sales. To be honest, a lot of my animals are reserved as soon as they're born. So with that, there aren't really a ton of animals for just walk up sales anyway. So I don't bring a ton to the shows anyhow. But that being said, you know, when you're selling $1,000 animals, you don't really,
your market's smaller.
You have 20 or 30 of them. You're not going to sell out. You know,
right.
It would be nice, but you know, I don't wholesale. I don't, you know, really do a whole lot of group deals or anything like that because I sell very well just online. And so having that knowledge and that sort of confidence in the market and knowing what I can and cannot sell for what pricing, kind of helps know what I'm going to do with the shows. But I'm generally sold out by November, December, or January for the most part. And, you know, that's of all my babies that are born in July and August. So it takes a few months, but, you know, I'm not sitting on baby snakes for a year or two. You know, if I'm selling a year-old animal, it's going to be because it was a holdback that I decided to part with, you know.
Yeah, now I wanted to ask before but we got off the subject, but I want to kind of track back, which seems to be a theme that we're doing.
That's our normal life.
Yeah, that's true.
We talking in circles. But
I want to kind of go over the type of enclosure and the keeping of the Barons racers.
So they're super hardy. And I mean, you can keep them like you would keep a corn snake. You know, they don't have a lot in the way of humidity requirements, you know, to keep them, you know. standard temperatures, that kind of a thing. As far as caging goes, again, not a whole lot in the way of humidity requirements. So I just keep them on aspen shavings, and they're fine. I've kept them successfully in a rack system, and they've done well. They've bred for me. They do get pretty big. I have some of my larger females are topping 7 feet.
Oh.
And so, but when I got kind of this second round of keeping them, and I got into the blue ones, they're just so beautiful to look at. I do use, now I have them in arboreal cages, with glass sliding fronts and that sort of thing. So I can look at them all the time. They're just so neat, and they're so active and alert and have such good eyesight, and they follow you when you walk through a room. They can be happy and healthy and breed well for you in a rack, but I like them in cages, because they're such interactive snakes and such alert snakes, that I do that. So what I do, I kind of do something of a community setup for them. I have 3 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot cages, and I stack them on top of each other, and I cut a hole with a PVC pipe between the top of the bottom one and the bottom of the top one, so they can pass up and down. I only have heat up at the top, heat and light up at the top, and nothing down on the bottom. That's just room temp, and so it allows them to thermoregulate better. I have seen them basking underneath the heat, at 90 degrees, and they'll keep themselves pretty warm. But again, I've had success with them in the past of just keeping them room temperature in a rack, so in the low 80s. So it can get a little dicey during feeding time if you're doing a community kind of style setup, because they can be very aggressive feeders as well. But that being said, I separate them and feed them, and they're great. But they're kind of social animals. They kind of like hanging out with each other, which is kind of neat to watch too.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, do they like being solitary, or are they always together? And is it always a male with a female that you have?
No, they hang out. During breeding season, the male is just relentless. It doesn't matter. 24 hours a day for like 4 months straight. He's just all over the girls, and they lie together, they cuddle together, they go in their hide boxes together. They're not apprehensive about being around each other at all. Males, females, it doesn't matter. So it's kind of neat to keep them in something of a community setup like that. It's something I obviously don't do with my indigos.
Just don't tell people on Facebook that you cohab, or else you may get lynched somewhere.
Yeah, well, listen, you're going to get lynched for saying just about anything these days, but I mean, like the downsides to what I'm doing is feeding. If they fight over the same food item or that kind of thing, but it's all supervised, and I generally separate them, during feeding time. I also kept a larger group together during breeding time, to get the males in with all the females kind of all together. And I did separate that stuff out kind of once breeding time ended, to give the females more of a stress-free environment where they're going to lay their eggs, and to kind of give them a break from the males. They're relentless. I separate a lot of that out. That makes feeding a lot easier. If you're just throwing a mouse or a chicken with 3 hungry Barons racers, you're going to have an issue. So I get where the part of what the cohab people are talking about.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that we've been flirting with, as far as if you got an enclosure big enough and a big display and keeping multiple animals in the same thing. I don't think that there's any downside to that, even though they are solitary for the most part in the wild. But I think it's something to explore. And then also, I mean, zoos have been doing it and have done it in the past, and people have been, another Southern California person there, he used to, I think, keep all of his stuff cohab.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get into keeping different species in the same space.
I meant
there's that, but just to clarify that out of the gate, I'm not into that. But I will say, there are types of snakes, and we want to transition to some of the tiger rat snakes we work with that are kind of social. And I don't want to sound too kooky. There are a lot of kind of weird conclusions that get drawn by reptile people about kind of just oddball theories and things, but there's something to it. I keep my my Mexican tiger rat snakes in the same fashion as the Barons racers, and there are absolutely times when they need to get comfortable with each other, and they hang out together. And there are times when they need their space from each other too, and they'll go to opposite ends, kind of a thing. But there's something to that, and I have a good friend who's been pretty successful with breeding the tiger rats. And one of the things that he talks about is that don't expect to just pair your snakes during breeding season and have it happen. That it does, in his experience, it does seem to help that the male knows the female and that they're familiar with each other. And maybe some of that is just a stress thing for sort of a, high strung snakes. Maybe that's a part of it, that they need to be comfortable if they're going to breed, kind of a thing. But yeah, I mean, the snakes that I keep together with those tiger rat snakes, I like it. I like keeping two of them together, and I feel like they do interact in kind of an odd way, and that there's a certain amount of comfort level of having the two of them together. And part of the other strategy behind that is that this is hopefully our first year to be breeding them. And being it that I'm still learning, again, it's talking about the learning curve and the process. I don't know for sure when's the best time to pair them up, and when the female's ovulating, and when they're going to breed and not breed, and that kind of thing. So I just keep it together all the time, And when they're going to do it, they're going to do it. And that was kind of the thing with the Barons racers. And I found that the Barons racers, they bred all winter and into the spring. I mean, they were breeding, from October, maybe even earlier, September, October, all the way through, February, March. And, I wouldn't have known that if I was just keeping them separately and introducing them one day a week, during what I perceived to be a breeding season. So that was partly intentional too, is just kind of, as I'm learning the project and as I'm learning the species and what's the best way, to handle their breeding behavior and husbandry, is just kind of let them do their thing for a while and figure it out.
With the tiger rats and the Baron racers, are you trying to breed, or do you envision breeding for a specific look or phenotype thing? Since with the indigos, you don't obviously get to do that because they're black as much. But yeah, are you like, oh, colors, like I want this specific thing?
Well, with the Barons racers for sure, and part of that is again kind of the learning curve. I don't know that anyone really knows for certain what makes a blue Barons racer, and is it a polymorphic thing? And some people have theorized that it's actually an axanthic trait that's making it blue. And when you take out the yellows out of the green, that you're left with the blue. So I'm kind of trying to figure that out myself. I'm breeding blue to blue, and I'm breeding blue to green. My sample size is still pretty small, because I've only been really breeding them for the last year or two. But, I have found a few things, and one of which is I bred last year a blue snake to a blue snake, and some of the babies were visibly blue right out of the egg, and others looked green. But a little bit different than sort of the green hatchlings that I'm used to. Usually the green hatchlings have kind of a yellow hue to their neck and their belly. And I wasn't seeing that. So I, despite people kind of coming and wanting to buy them and whatever else, I wasn't going to sell any of the greens. I said, look, I'm going to keep these for, 4 months, 6 months until I kind of see what happens. And what I found is that the ones that hatched green turned blue anyway.
Really? Okay.
Which was odd, because some of them started blue right out of the egg. So that's kind of one of the things that I'm trying to figure out. And this year I'm breeding a blue to a green. We'll see what happens there. Many years ago, back when I used to import them, I bred a green one to a brown one. And I got some green babies and I got some brown babies. But this year my goal is to breed blue to blue, blue to green. And then I'm just keeping the browns in a whole separate category. The browns are all breeding together. And the brown ones are actually something I think is pretty underappreciated and underrated. Generally speaking, people want color and flashiness, but the brown Barons races are really neat. And they're super uncommon too. Probably the least common out of all those colors.
Just because whoever's collecting, or even people who are breeding, are just not paying attention.
Yeah, something like that. It's just they're not as readily available. I ended up getting a male from Europe because I couldn't find any around the US.
Wow. I literally know nothing about Baron racers, but just quickly looking it up, what stands out to me other than the color, like the stripe, I really like solid, thick black stripe. And are you noticing, is that something that's more in the blues, more in the greens, more like, is there
and
any
the babies
right? Is there any sort of rhyme or reason to that stripe?
From what I've noticed, that whatever they're born with, they generally keep. The color can change as they age, but as far as the black stripe goes, it seems to be whatever they're born with. That being said, I have also seen, if you look through enough pictures, you'll see that there are some that sort of have like a black webbing around the stripe, particularly further down the body. I have seen that develop more with age, which is kind of cool. But as far as a rhyme or reason to, what the stripe is going to look like as they're born, it seems like that's just sort of a variable, random thing with tendencies towards whatever the parents look like. There are some, and I have some that have very little stripe. It's hardly noticeable.
Oh, wow.
And others where it's very pronounced. And so, that's another element to how they can look, in addition to just kind of the different palette of colors.
I think someone's going to get a Baron's racer.
I don't know. I'm like looking at one on Google and I really like that one.
They're really cool. And the blue ones are really neat too. I mean, it's this is not a sales pitch. They're very easy to keep. They're very alert. They're very intelligent. They're really, same as indigos. They have a sledgehammer of a feeding response, but yet they're generally pretty docile. They generally don't bite a whole lot out of defense. And despite being, active and wiry and flighty at times when you hold them, they calm quickly and tend to be pretty handleable. They are rear-fanged, so I am cautious in working with them. I know people that have been bitten and just report nothing more than localized swelling, but really, I don't, when you're talking about rear-fang stuff, you always want to be careful because you don't know how your body's going to react to it. The Mussurana are rear-fanged as well. But that being said, they're not really a defensive snake. They're really neat.
Do they burrow because of that nose thing?
Nose.
Yeah, I just think of like
really. It's more along the arboreal sense of like a leaf nose snake or a twig snake or something like that they'll or a rhino rat. They're not really a fossorial kind of thing that's going to dig. They're going to be more climbing and trying to blend in with branches. That being said, as their slender body type and nose would suggest, they're probably not as exclusively arboreal as people might think. They've been described to me by people that have seen them in the wild as kind of being semi-arboreal. But they're neat snakes. I like them a lot.
And I know some of our snakes, like corn snakes too, they start out more arboreal, and then as they get larger, they stay more terrestrial. Do you find you would have the same thing going on with these guys?
Not that I've noticed. I mean, I offer an arboreal setup, and they use it. They sit on the ground, but they also sit up in the branches quite a bit, and it doesn't matter if they're adults or babies. Although I will say I generally don't really offer an arboreal setting for the babies because I'm keeping them in racks. And I move them up to caging when they're close to adult size. But so I don't know if I can really speak too educatedly on that.
All right.
Alex Millership in the chat asked, "What is the worst snake bite you've ever gotten?"
Well, that one on the nose is pretty bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have yet to really take a bad bite from any of my rear-fanged animals. I tend to be pretty overly cautious with that, but I think the one on the nose was the worst. Yeah.
Yeah, that will do it. I mean, I just freak out. Like, it's a surprise sometimes when the olive comes out and his head's just like he's just looking for something.
Oh yeah, it's shocking.
Yeah, and you just don't see it coming sometimes. Well, really, I'm just stupid, I guess. I should expect
You should see it coming. You've had it for long enough.
The front of the tub's clear. I should know there's a snake there, but whatever. I'm not that smart.
Okay, we are over time, but I have one last question. Totally random.
Shoot.
But total I can't think of the word. How much is your wife involved in this whole process?
Always your question.
That's always my question because I'm a girl and I think these things.
Listen, it's a reasonable question. It's kind of funny because I share kind of stories with her as I interact with people and buyers and so forth. You would be surprised well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised at how many guys come to me saying, I need to hide this from my wife, or I need to, I can spend this much without her noticing, or, something along those lines. And it happens all the time, So anyway, but that's just a funny comment on the side. But that being said, she's not really involved at all in the care. She likes them, she tolerates them, she appreciates them for their beauty and what they are, but is not necessarily a reptile person. So it's sort of keep whatever you want in the reptile room, and don't bring the smell or the animals into the house, and you can do whatever you want. So she's very understanding. She's very tolerant of what I do and my hobby and that sort of thing. And and as far as the hiding money and all that sort of stuff, she knows that I'm pretty responsible with the way I spend and sell. So it works out. It works out.
And you mentioned before that your kids handle some of your snakes. Do your kids enjoy it, and do they get into it as well?
They do. They like going out looking for snakes with me, and we're out camping and playing around with snakes all the time. They know the bulk of what I have are not necessarily animals for kids. I don't, even my more docile ones, I don't let them play with any of my rear fang stuff. Just why just err on the side of caution, kind of a thing. And but they'll check out the big indigos and cribos when I have them around, and some of the smaller animals that are more handleable. I keep a couple snakes around just kind of for them to play with, some rosy boas and things that we find, and that kind of thing they like playing with. So they like them. It's all good. They prefer the tortoises though.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I mean, there's just so many things. There's a few things that we didn't even hit. Like, I feel like we could do a whole thing on spilotes and then the field herping and all that stuff.
Well, we'll definitely have to have him back on then.
Round 2. Yeah, not a problem.
Is there anything that you'd want to get out there before we end the show? And also, where can people get in touch with you?
Well, the best way to get in touch with me is through my website, which is blackpearlreptiles.com. And there's a care sheet there. There are pictures of the adults and all the kind of animals that we work with. So that's the best way to kind of educate yourself on what we do and all of that. And as far as, anything else to know, it's like anything else. The snakes that I work with are not necessarily for beginners. But they can be kept, responsibly, and if you do your research. And the people that I really enjoy working with, I don't mind working with beginners, and I don't mind selling to beginners, but I really enjoy working with the people that are doing their due diligence. And a lot of reptile breeders, talk about, serious inquiries only and don't waste my time, kind of a thing. And certainly my time is valuable as well. But I like people that ask questions. I like people that do their research. This day and age is kind of interesting in that people kind of expect and look for answers more quickly in this kind of digital age. But there's so much out there online. Spend time on my website. Spend time looking around, and doing your research on whatever kind of animal you end up with. And if you're going to buy something kind of more obscure or higher end, which is kind of what I aim to offer, it behooves you to do your interest, because not only is it better for the animal, but it's better for you. And so those are kind of a lot of the people I enjoy working with. There are people that really want to know what they're getting into.
Absolutely. It's something that I can imagine would be super important in that. And it's also super important that, like, people that sell snakes all the time, at least rare stuff, and like, they get mad when people ask questions, but if you have like all the resources online, you can just say, hey, go look at my website. Or like, for me, we get it all the time. Like, hey, dude, I have like a bunch of videos on that. Just check out videos on.
Yeah. And I will say that is sort of the frustrating part. I don't mind answering questions, and I try to be as helpful as I can, but I think that there's a whole kind of subsection of people that I generally don't find as valuable to work with, that are people that are going to ask questions before doing research, you know, and to a certain degree, I don't mind that as much, but yeah, I mean, it's all right there. When you're getting questions that are, you know, a couple keystrokes away on your computer, you know, that can be frustrating. I'm not going to lie on that one. You know, that's why I try to keep most of the information that people would need. 90% of the questions are going to be answered on the website or on the internet. You know, so, but yeah, so that can be a frustrating part. You know, I generally, you know, look for people, you know, research first, answer as many of your questions as you can from as many different sources as you can, and, you know, and then ask questions.
Gotcha.
Anything else?
No, that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on. We've already established we need you on again.
All right. Be happy to. It's been a lot of fun, guys.
Yeah, it's been great. And then to anyone who's listening, I said this in the chat, but I wanted to say it on here just to have it on the downloads or whatever, that this weekend we're going to be doubling up podcasts. On Sunday, we will...
Oh, was that weird? That was like a creepy... Like,
that was a creepy Casper.
Like a haunted house.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, everyone. Let's go.
That's really
rewind.
Hard.
Okay. Let's go. Oh, yeah. Or crowd applause.
Gosh, that was bad. So this Sunday we will have Philip Starkey on from, was it Star Pythons? And
he is from Germany, I believe. So international.
Yes, that's why it's on Sunday. And then Monday is going to be Owen McIntyre. And so I know a lot of people are looking forward to us talking to Owen. And so, yes, get ready for 2 podcasts in 1 week.
2 carpet python podcasts in 1 week. I guess it's not too far off with what we do usually.
We do a lot of carpet, but yeah. Okay. Again, thank you, John, for coming on.
You got to do our stuff.
Oh, sorry. If you want to reach us, obviously, if you're listening to this download or watching it live right now, you've already found us on YouTube, but Port City Pythons on YouTube, Port City Pythons on Instagram, portcitypythons.com. If you want to email us, it's theportcitypythons@gmail.com. Anything else?
That is it. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will catch you on a random day and next weekend, right? Sunday
and Monday.
Sunday.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.